Hey, John, you're the first here with a minute to go.
Hi, Dan. Good morning.
How's it going?
Good. Viewing you from Hurricane Land,
Um, uh, where are you?
Southern California.
Oh, really? The hurricane made it. That was the one that caused the problems in Hawaii, huh?
I think it's a different one. I thought that one was traveling west for some strange reason.
Hmm.
But uh, yeah, so this one is, I mean, every so often we get a hurricane that's in the southwest,
Hmm.
and it'll give us a nice summer thunderstorm or something. This is the first one since 1939 that's actually going to make landfall.
Wow.
Yeah, I've lived here since 1950 and I've never seen this before.
Interesting.
So this is yeah, they're expecting it to be quite significant.
Hmm.
Here it's a month's worth of rain in a few hours.
That's what they say.
Wow.
And even Palm Springs. Palm Springs is directly in the path.
Wow.
So, um, who's moving? I mean, you know, I had a friend who moved to Prince Edward Island, but he was up a few miles outside Yellowknife. So he moved maybe 2 years ago, maybe a little bit less.
Hmm.
So he's sort of semi laughing that he missed the fire. The only problem was when he landed at Prince Edward Island, and within the first year, the 20-acre land plot that he had, that was the house, it's surrounded by trees in the forest, became the house surrounded by trees, not in a forest, but all laying on the ground.
Hmm.
Because he got whatever it was, the Atlantic one that went all the way up to the high end past New York, of course, and called Prince Edward Island.
Hmm.
So it took him 6 or 7 months before everything had settled down enough so he could go around with a chainsaw
Hmm.
to clear up. But it took 2 weeks just to clear the roadway.
Sure. Yeah.
You know,
It's amazing when trees blow down. Oftentimes they just, I mean, there are still around here where I live, there was a big blowdown, a straight line, really incredible straight line winds in like 2012, just a month or so before I arrived. There are still trees in the woods that, there are parts of the woods that are just kind of over. Um, yeah, because it wasn't somebody's responsibility to, sort of go in and and fix that. And they create, of course, um, dry fuel conditions that lead to fires as well and stuff like that. So yeah, it's I guess we got to avoid the urge to say that everything is changing because of climate change, but first time since 1939 does sound significant.
Yeah, the cabin that you sometimes see me working at is up in that same area. And you talk about nobody being responsible. We live, back off a road. There's a road that comes up, and the people that live in that area who have acreages, we have some. And before the people that we bought it from, they had to clear out all those down trees because they, like you said, they created a fire hazard,
Mm-hmm.
and the local fire folks, made you do that, or they wouldn't be willing to come back in there should you have a fire at your place.
Right. Yeah. 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 The only effect. I mean, it actually happened between the time in May, around mid-May, that I drove from New Hampshire, where we lived, to up here to northern Minnesota to look at houses, and sort of picked out a house. We got the paperwork going and everything, and then we were going to move in the second week of July. And in between May and July, there had been this big straight line wind storm. And the only thing that had happened on this property was it knocked over the flagpole. So they had to call us up and say, hey, the flagpole is gone. Sorry about that. We'll give you a trailer instead. And you know, and my response is, I didn't really notice. I guess I noticed that there was a flagpole, but I didn't really care at all. But I'll take the trailer. So I got a trailer. It was an old aluminum trailer. It wasn't really roadworthy, but I built a chicken house on it that I was able to drag around the field, and the chickens could live in when I was raising them on the pasture. So yeah, so there's crazy things happening in the world. You know, Hawaii, and someplace else, Tenerife, and now Southern California, and apparently it's like oven hot in the Persian Gulf, right? 81 centigrade I saw was a number that they were kicking around a couple of days ago at the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula, someplace, which is like something like 178 Fahrenheit.
It might have been 81 Fahrenheit, but
no, it was 81. They actually, I mean, I saw a legitimate news item that said 81 Celsius was recorded.
Well, then maybe it's where the Persian Gulf becomes Persian as opposed to the Arabian Gulf that's nice and here, the south side. In the 15 odd years I've been here, I've had 57 centigrade in the shade, but in the deep desert.
Mm-hmm.
And by that, I mean like a 3-hour drive from the coast here. So it's like 300 kilometers in towards the Saudi border, to the area that they call I forgot what they call it now. There's an area where the border goes a bit fuzzy, so they draw a diamond, as in this bit's not claimed properly. Between them and us. But it's we passed
a place called Kezim Island in Iran, according to this, this news report.
Persian area.
Yeah.
Although quite how it gets that hot, that far north relative, because it's, having said that, the Gulf is only like 60, 70 miles across, such that you need to stand on a tall building so you can see the other side just about.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like English Channel, where you can sort of see Calais.
Yeah.
So, but the place that I'm thinking of is like 100 miles north of the last oasis. It's like a long way to go for a bottle of water.
Yeah.
So, don't get stuck. Don't get off the road.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me wonder, in those terms, I've got a relatively hard road. It's not necessarily all tarmacs, but it's a hard road. And I then think on things like one of my favourite films, the David Lean, Lawrence of Arabia, where he's talking about crossing the Nefu Desert. And the Nefu Desert is effectively the right-hand side of Sinai, goes up to Aqaba and Eilat, now in Israel, go east. So you're in Iraq, Jordan boundary area. And so it's things like the Wadi Rum and stuff. And that's a real tough place. But a lot of the Jordanian side gets quite high. So it's relatively cool, but you come off that escarpment and drop. You go down to the Wadi Rum proper. And there's some nice mountains there, pictorially nice mountains, as well as good climbing. Mad Dogs and Englishmen, Midday Sun and all that crap. I was climbing some of those in August for my first trip out east of Suez.
Mm.
And it also turned out to be Ramadan. So by the time we finally got into Aqaba, it's like, okay, it's like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But we're gonna have to wait till 8 to go eat.
Mhm.
And I said, oh, great. We've been up since like 4 in the morning to drive down in the relatively cool morning. But yeah, 57 in the shade with no wind
Mhm.
in a dusty desert, and deciding that it might not start till it cools down a bit, type thing, because it's just too hot.
Yeah.
And it's like, I've got phone signal, because here, oddly enough, we have phone signal everywhere. It's the way they spy on us properly. Anyway, and it's like, okay, so where's the nearest petrol station? Oh, that's nearer than the next oasis. It's only 75 miles away.
Mm.
And it's like, yeah, okay. They should have filled up. Still had over half a tank, and I should have filled up. And it's all those sorts of things that you start to say, okay, it's a good idea to come out as 2 cars, 6 people, 7 tow ropes and sand mats, and 6 cool boxes and 50 litres of water, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. By default, not just with a fire extinguisher and a little Walker's type first aid pack. And it start to treat things differently, as in, like not driving in a straight line when you're off road, because the heat of a car engine, if you go over a bush, it's likely to set fire to the bush because the engine's so hot. The bush wasn't cold in the first place.
Right.
So there's all those sorts of things that, if you were out with Monty in Libya against Rommel, you would have known.
Yeah. I actually had that happen with a riding mower in a field, and it bottomed out in a kind of a gopher hole, and the bottom, the mowing parts were hot enough that it set the grass on fire, and the fire department had to come and spray it down. That was a couple of years ago. There's still the skeleton and the thing, of course, the whole mower caught fire, and the gasoline and the plastic melted and all that. It was a crazy event.
And it also makes me wonder why people think solar cooking is such a problem. When this summer you could literally fry eggs on your car bonnet with no thought. You didn't have to think about it. You just do it.
Right.
And it's, I've seen pictures from sort of grandparents and friends of grandparents of them cooking stuff in southern Italy, in Crete, in Greece, and Libya from World War II, and even Malta. Malta is not very big, not very tall, surrounded by the cool waters of the Mediterranean, which is quite the North Atlantic, but still cool enough. And yet they're still cooking on the metal, whatever, of the boats and the trucks and stuff. So anyway.
Yeah. Well, so the climate thing is a little bit connected with Naomi Oreskes. We're going to, I suppose we'll come back to that. We had also talked at the end of the last of our last meeting about, we had sort of threatened to talk a little bit about online fora for discussion and things like that. I had started talking a little bit about Substack and, and there are, the other ones. And so do we want to do that? Do we want to kind of begin by sort of talking a little bit about sort of the state of, of what we're using, how we're using things, where we see things going? Because I am curious about that, because I am spending a little bit of time kind of.
Yeah, I'm curious too. I thought it was my impression that some of you had used Substack, which was I was completely unfamiliar with.
Mm-hmm.
I've used Medium a little bit, and I mean, I don't have particular motives to generate any income, but I'm interested in,
Mm-hmm.
if I write something, I hope somebody reads it, So I'm just interested in what some of the rest of you have done.
Yeah.
The other thing, of course, is although this group, particularly when we include Chris, which I notice is not here again.
Mm-hmm.
Is he on fire, or is he flooded, or is he just waiting for the rain?
I think he said he was going to be away for a couple of weeks. Yeah. So
Did he? I must have missed him.
yeah, he has. He has been online. I've seen him comment on comments that I've posted and stuff.
I bumped into him and sort of friended and followed him on elsewhere on social media. Mm-hmm. In another channel.
Yeah.
I'm talking about Mark's concern more as a consumer than a creator. So, mm-hmm. As much as I might follow several of you in Substack or Medium, the thing I noticed with those two places is that they have both now started to allow you to highlight and publish those highlights within the platform, and now notes, such that the author and other people within the platform can see your notes and therefore comment on your notes.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also two programs that have evolved from read me later pocket type equivalents.
Mm-hmm.
One is Clasp and the other one is Omnivore. And at the moment I'm trialing both of them in parallel.
Mm-hmm.
And they're both currently freebie things. And they, with odd exceptions, such that they won't look at bank sites and they won't look at your email and they won't look at one or two other sites, but virtually otherwise any other site, you can highlight a paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
Say, you could tag a page to go back to, and you could then add a comment to your highlight. Those are the two primary starting points. Once you've done one of those starting points, because it now gives you a link to the page, you can add tags and comments to the page that you're looking at as well. And because you can add tags, you can therefore search by those tags.
Mm-hmm.
And both of them either have already or are about to have semi-automatic to full automatic export into the likes of Obsidian,
mm-hmm.
for instance. And because they've now got tags, and if you use the same structure of tags in Obsidian, you're 20% further down the road than you might otherwise be. They're both seemingly quite small at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And Clasp talks to its users via Slack, and Omnivore talks to its users via Mastodon, as opposed to like Obsidian has its own internal forum,
mm-hmm.
wherever that is. It looks like looks like a GitHub clone or something.
Mhm.
And so far, I don't believe either of them have got a user level plugin environment, but I think that might come. They're
Mhm.
both talking about doing an API such that they can then automatically pair up with lots more
Mhm.
note-taking type platforms or publishing type platforms, such that they are able to drop stuff into other things so you can then create content faster.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, yeah. I think
they,
Mark just
they both
put a
they
put
both
a.
seem to be very equivalent. It doesn't seem to be much
Uh-huh.
other than one's a little bit ahead in certain areas than the other, and vice versa.
Right, right.
And Omnivore has got a single highlight color with tags and notes and automatic drop into Obsidian, whereas Clasp has got 4 color highlights, but doesn't yet automatically drop into Obsidian.
Okay. So one of the questions, and I think Mark sort of is getting towards this in the chat, is when are these things really sort of personal aggregator and and kind of curation tools where where I, for instance, could go get a feed, could go get a bunch of stuff, aggregate it together, like for looking at later. I used to have something on my phone that would do that as well, that I stopped paying for, and so now it still sends me begging messages, but I guess that that's one of the things that that I'm sort of curious about is is there a difference really? There may not be one functionally, right? But is there a difference in kind of the way these things are perceived and used, where some of them are thought of as, okay, this is my personal tool for pulling together all the stuff that I'm interested in, and then making sense of it, or is it an external forum for discussion? And Mark, you mentioned Hypothesis, and it's kind of, it kind of has the ability to do both, right? Because I follow Chris's stream of thought in Hypothesis, right? By basically being able to, he doesn't hide any of that stuff, so I can search all his public stuff, but oftentimes it's useful to to have a place. Like I remember a couple of years ago, there was a group that was doing an annotation. There were these sort of meetups called iAnnotate. Do you remember those? And and they would kind of get together and kind of do a social annotation on a text. I mean, kind of like a book club sort of a thing, only with a text. Like I think there was a was it a Doug Engelbart, or it was one of those, kind of one of those early computational sort of visionary things, and that was kind of interesting. That sort of built some kind of group energy and some kind of discussion on top of that thing. And I guess that leads in my mind to another question, because there seem to be these things like that want, that recognize, I mean, that recognize that there's a space here and want to play, right? Like Elon wants Twitter X to be a place for long form, right? He wants to try to grab that space as well from from a Substack or from a Medium or something like that, which I don't see the synergy or the advantage there. But I guess a question that I have still, I'm wandering too far afield from, is how much is it about conversation, and how much of it is about essay writing? Because that was the sense I got from Medium, was it was for people to sort of take kind of polished, finished product kinds of essays or articles and put them up there for people to read and respond to, but mostly to read.
It seems like, though, there's also the issue of commerce, right?
Mhm.
In that there obviously are efforts to find a financial component for those folks who are able and willing to attract an audience.
Mhm.
I mean, through diligence and skill and whatever. And some services are built around that. So, I mean, I don't know if you see subs. I don't know. Like, I know Chris was a big hypothesis person, at least early on. I don't know if he was actually connected with the service or not, but he seems to have really invested a lot in that particular environment.
I think he was. I think it was when it was small. It was really easy to get in contact and to have conversations with people like Jeremy Dean and
Right.
all the folks that were at Hypothesis. They were very kind of outward facing and yeah. So I think that I had conversations, and then Hypothesis had that issue where they this thing exploded and became very
Right.
big, but then it was sort of like, oh wait a minute, how are we going to make money? Right. So then they tried to create an LTI extension that would bolt on
Right.
to a learning management system at a university, and they could bill for that. And they weren't able to really, in my mind, provide enough meat that on those bones that was different from the free service operating in the wild.
Like Dan and I seem to be having this kind of side conversation that in some ways, deals with the legitimacy of different forms of commercialization, whether it be commercial textbooks or other services. And I mean, I've always been of the opinion that there has to be money in the system somewhere. It's kind of funny we're reading about capitalism so much, right?
Yeah.
But what's a fair way to do that, and what's a way to do that to maintain the interest of people that's necessary to invest time and talent in any enterprise. I mean, I don't know if that's too big of a picture, but I think you're dealing with kind of with that issue now, and all of us, I think, have played with it to some extent.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just I'm retired and at my age, but I find it intellectually interesting, all these services, where they're going. Is there a legitimate market? How will that be fostered? What's a legitimate price? Like the issue of the Substack versus Medium, I think is interesting. I think you have two commercial models here. I mean, as I understand Substack, to me, it's more for the really outstanding people who can demand or whatever a certain commitment. It's essentially what, $50 a year, right?
Yeah.
Versus the Medium model, which is $50 a year, all you can eat as a consumer. So when he's talking about looking at these things from the perspective of the consumer, seems to me Medium is more that second model. And of course,
and I haven't been on there a while. So is there a sense on Medium that
I don't use either one.
Okay. So that's one thing that I was curious about was, if I pay Medium,
right,
$50, will they somehow curate or quality control or do something, that will ensure, hey, here comes Chris.
Yeah, there's Chris. Good. I don't know, Dan. I just see maybe that's not the real difference.
Yeah.
And it seems to some extent it depends on, like so many things, your ability to compete in the market. If you can attract an audience, you're probably better off in Substack, right? If
I think. Hey, Chris.
That capability.
Well, it's interesting. I think that there is there are some questions about where the money gets involved and where the money sticks to, right? Does the money stick to individual creators and mostly get passed through to them, which is kind of the Substack model, or is there some type of a relationship? And as Chris has kind of pointed out, obviously, also there are people who are gaming the Substack model and who are getting some type of anchor tenant kind of perks that that the rest of us don't get. So yeah, we decided we would start by talking about media, and I really think, I mean, I keep bringing him up, and we've never actually read one of his books, but I think Jaron Lanier did have some interesting things to say about that. About and especially because he went back, he was the first person or the first author that ever referred to Ted Nelson, right? So that's how I discovered Ted Nelson, and that whole idea that there would be, that in the old model there was, going to be bidirectional linking, so there was going to be some type of micro payment oriented financial system bolted onto the linking capability.
Well, there's clearly a video option, through YouTube, but also there are a lot of, I mean, what was the name? It was a woman's name, Linda. I don't know if you ever did Linda videos, but there's a lot of technology oriented stuff in various levels and kinds, but it was a subscription service. And so I think there are folks trying to identify teaching/learning opportunities that could encourage the exchange of money. Let's put it that.
Yeah. Well, it's weird because the commercial, and we have been sort of having this side conversation in the comments on my announcement that I'm going to be doing more with open education on my Substack, and I think there are a lot. I think the points that you make, I think are many of the things that I've sort of got queued up about of things that I want to talk about. Sort of the because part of this, I mean, this all comes out of this consolidation of the textbook industry and this sort of monopolistic power that they have to just command prices that are becoming ridiculous. But there is that, and the open textbook movement, the OER movement, it really exploded as a reaction to that. And then also, but as I mentioned, as the first thing that occurred to me when I got retrenched was, hey, wait a minute, can I afford to continue doing this stuff all for free? I'm putting up these free textbooks, and I kind of decided on like day 2 to take back, and I sort of regret the decision to sort of take back the note making free version and say, well, okay, now I'm thinking I'll put it back up. I'm going to revise it, and I'm going to put in a thing that's not quite. I'm going to make it not quite as I've left electronics and I'm back on paper sort of thing, which was where I was at the time. So I'm going to put in a little chapter saying, well, or you could use Obsidian. This is how that works, and then make that available again. But that, yeah, there is that question of of how people who are, some people just do it because they love it and it's their avocation, and they've got, they're paying the bills doing something else. And so they, but even so, to whatever extent people are getting value out of things, I think if we can, partially, I think the thing that prevents us from doing that is the way that capitalism, this capitalism that we've been talking about for months and months, is structured, makes it seem like, and I think Lanier says this about, sort of the early days of, of Silicon Valley and of this, sort of new whole earth catalog culture, this kind of Stuart Brand and these people, sort of also being involved in, early homebrew computing and the web and stuff like that. The counterculture nature of that was in a sense, it was an anti-capitalist thing, right? Because the big, the internet came out of, the ARPANET, so there was a governmental, military industrial complex element to it. The big nodes were places like Stanford and Los Alamos, and MIT, right? And so, so there was that. And then the big companies were IBM and Hewlett Packard, in the Valley. And so there was, so all of that, kind of goes to, that's the background against which this thing is Rheingold. Yeah. Well, and actually, I think it was probably the Rheingold. I was mentioning earlier that one of the iAnnotate things, I think it was probably a Rheingold thing that people had read together on using hypothesis. But yeah, oops, it's fly season up here. So yes, it's weird though, because there have been places that earlier we were also kind of talking about how much is it that how much is sort of the personal sort of accumulation and processing sort of activity, and then how much of it is the outward facing. I'm presenting something. It's that step of taking my all my notes and turning them into an actual written product and bringing that back out to the world. And one of the things that I have seen, one of the comment streams that I've kind of been participating in, I don't remember which Substack it actually came from, but it was about whether or not Substack should emphasize or deliberately de-emphasize things like audio and video. Because some people are saying, make it a text thing. I like the text. I come here for the text. I don't want to see, a bunch of feeds that are, memes or videos or, shorts or, clips or even audio. But then, it's sort of like, well, how many of these media can kind of exist on the landscape, and at what point does it become too fragmented to be I think it's worthwhile to be on Substack, I guess. I think Chris, you're sort of the example of the own it all yourself, have a private, own your domain, host it privately, and let people come. How's that?
Well, it just means the distributor isn't taking 30%, or in many cases, a lot more.
Yeah.
So, YouTube is taking a huge chunk, and there's only maybe 12 people in the world that are really have big incomes.
Right.
But to do that, they also usually quietly have a staff of 10 or 12 people. Mm-hmm. Who are the duck feet under the water doing this.
Right.
And if you're in that echelon, it's great, but it makes it look like everybody can make a living doing this, when in fact the vast majority of people are, here's my day job that I don't talk a lot about, and I make it look like I'm a content creator. Mm-hmm. But then the other secret too is, do you know what the word funnel means and how to use it and leverage it properly? Mm-hmm. And have you been able to find the right amount of, cat memes mm-hmm. to throw into your content,
right,
to get engagement to drive the thing? So, probably a useful example too is, if you go back and look at the path that the getting things done arc looked like, I think his original book came out in 2002. Mm-hmm. And he had a book to sell, and that was the product.
Right.
And I'm going to do the courses and videos as an add-on product. But then the product became not the book, but all the courses and the add-on stuff.
Sure. Yeah.
But to continue driving that, eventually you're going to get bored to tears of teaching the same thing. Mm-hmm. And your funnel has to be being filled with new people constantly,
right? Because
no one's going to take your course 4 times.
Right.
So you always need new influx.
Uh-huh.
And, eventually you're going to reach a peak where everybody's heard of your thing and knows what it is, or everybody's given away the one-page blog post of here's how you start.
Well, and
So-
how long can you
Together.
live on your one idea? Yeah.
So,
Well-
you'll probably already have noticed that you don't see Scott Shepper flogging Zettelkasten anymore because the books come out.
Mhm.
And how do you make more money doing that thing without being bored? Or if you're let's say Tiago Forte is another good example in the space.
Yeah.
Like book one comes out, you make a lot of free videos. Book two now is out this week, so we'll flog that for a while.
Mhm.
And you have a network of people, and it's not you teaching the course, it's other people teaching or co-teaching the course. But eventually that's gonna get old, and so how do you pivot every 3 or 4 years when you get bored
Right.
with
How do you
what the
become
thing
Tim
is?
Ferriss instead of Tiago?
You know,
Yeah, but in that example, I mean, David Allen is still only the one book franchise,
Mhm.
and he seems to be quite happy with letting the book do what the book's going to do, because we all need, as when we come up to a stage in our life that we want to do, getting things done, we go buy the book.
Right.
So there is that constant inflow of new people who eventually Google getting things done, David Allen, YouTube, and says, "Oh look, there's 150 YouTubes I can watch." So they get secondary reuse.
Mhm.
But the example that I was thinking of, where he's effectively sold, this was my journey through YouTube, which was Ali Abdul.
Mhm.
Here's a medical doctor was in the process of saying, how do I teach people a little bit easier? I'll do it for YouTube, and then completely pivots away, and he's now supposedly a millionaire because he does the courses on how to make YouTubes.
Yeah,
He's
and he's
also
a
got-
lifestyle. He's a lifestyle
Yeah, but-
influencer now, right?
But he does. But you get to him
Mhm.
by YouTube. He does his courses off that, but it's mostly how to build a YouTube channel. So it's funnel, marketing, landing page, blog, blah 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 blah. You know,
Yeah.
and it's. You could possibly, I don't know, 5 years ago, you could probably get half of what Ali does for free off of the likes of Steve Dotto, you know, who's probably older than most of us put together. But the Tiago one was, of course, he clearly had stopped gaining income just from doing courses based on praxis, whatever the praxis thing was, and talking about
Yeah.
second brain and the para method with no book.
Mhm.
So he's obviously decided the book, Tim Ferriss wise, clearly, Tim Ferriss has got what, 5 books out, 6 books out, but it's all supported on his now the biggest podcast channel going. That is duplicated on YouTube. So you see the video, if there is a video,
Mhm.
once in a blue moon, it's just a dumb graphic on a podcast. Yet you can still get the transcript, the podcast direct, download it as an MP3 file if you want, and the show notes, which is a separate file from the transcript, and watch it on YouTube if YouTube is the channel you want to use.
Mhm.
So, and he clearly has a team. And Ali Abdul clearly has a team, and he talks about that. It's like there he was 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, saying, this is running me ragged. I've just stopped doing my normal day job, and my sort of income has halved, and I can't do enough because it takes me 3 days to edit a video because I'm not that good an editor, but I'm learning as I go. And I've got to write the script, and I've got to make the video, and I've got to then put it up, and I've got et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
And now, of course, it's got a team of about 10, I suppose, he talks about.
Mhm.
So now he's a company, you know.
Yeah.
That's
I
what-
kind of,
that's
I sort of was
the
watching him
means of production.
really, a year or two ago. I haven't watched him lately. It's, yeah, it's weird when it becomes about the, and I've sort of resisted, kind of the production values argument, right? Oh, you got to have backing, music, and you got to do, it's like I don't want to do that. I would like it to be more about the content and less about the presentation, which is why, maybe why I'm leaning, more kind of towards
But-
Substack as well. But also, there's also this thing that happens, and I was reminded of it very sort of graphically yesterday. I was reading a bunch of Substacks in my inbox, and one of them that came up was from Jessie Meadows, who has a thing called Sluggish, and she's a young, looks to be 20 something or early 30 somethings, writer and artist. And she says her thing is repoliticizing mental illness and embracing the weird. And she had done one about Andrew Huberman, and it was kind of funny because I had been listening to Huberman podcasts and stuff, and she kind of pointed out in a really interesting way that I thought was very smart about how over time, he sort of leaned into the things he discovered a niche, and he sort of leaned into the types of things that would appeal to the people, so he changed to accommodate his market, right? And it was about and it became more about sort of this dopamine cult, and and dopamine testosterone, and and all this kind of fitness adjacent stuff that was maybe related to his actual what his lab does at Stanford, because he's an ophthalmologist, and so his big thing is the low angle morning sunlight is like if he's got one stake in the ground, kind of that's the major one. But I had I thought she sort of very smartly and kind of interestingly saw through this thing, and actually she connected it to like Kellogg, and and these people, Sluggish, Sluggish, that is what it's called. And so here, so she's and she connected it, and an interesting, I thought, because I'm interested in the Gilded Age, she connected it to this early 20th century Gilded Age, sort of focus on morality, sort of like when you're trying to sort of rein in, and her thesis, I think, is, when you're trying to, to control society, right, and rein in these people, who might want to go off and become populists or something, you have to tell them, that they have to, conserve their semen or whatever. I mean, that's the big thing always, right? And apparently that's the big thing with Huberman too now, so that so that's the dopamine addiction, but taking a cold plunge is good dopamine, but cocaine or masturbation is bad dopamine, and it's weird, so there do seem to be particular media that lend themselves to this, and ways that you sort of that people can sort of alter themselves to become appealing to markets in based on these different media.
So the secret is
I don't want to do that.
You need your audience of about 100,000 that's either self-sustaining or self-replacing. And then the next question is, what cult are you going to build?
Yeah.
And when you figure out what your cult is, go.
Yeah.
There is a really, I haven't seen it yet, but there's a really good, like how to build a cult documentary series on Netflix right now.
Oh, nice.
That will give you all the language and verbiage and how to structure it. It's done a little tongue in cheek,
Hmm.
essentially the way we're talking about it now, but like, that's where I would start.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then once you figure out what your cult is, then you start building your funnel and figure out what's the thing that I give away for free. Is it chapter 1 about how to take notes?
Right.
And, or is it, because the humanities are collapsing upon them themselves now, and the crazy religious right is owning some of the how to think critically, but without actually thinking critically.
Hmm.
Maybe you could come at that from the left and replace the how to think, how to.
Yeah. Well, it's weird too because these things are because history is not something that people know, right? I've also noticed on Substack that there is this group of people, and they're mostly associated with what they call the Rising Tide Foundation, who are really doing some weird things with especially American history, but American and British history particularly. And apparently behind it all is China, and behind it all is the interest of the new the new China, and so that's been kind of weird to me. It is kind of weird because I mean, going back, stepping back from this to that question of, well, okay, how do you, to the micropayments idea, right? How do you, articulate a little value, not a cult, not a cult sort of thing. I mean, and another example of that is, that Heather, I'm sure, I don't know for sure, but I suspect it probably doesn't write her daily letters from an American anymore, all by herself, because it seems like nowadays they're just sort of compilations, they're curations of the left news, right? And so so there were, there's just this list of, all of the all of the legal actions and indictments against Trump, but none of the ones against Biden, and that sort of thing. And and she has a cult around that. She has millions of subscribers and probably tens or hundreds of thousands of paying subscribers, but all that makes her is is MSNBC with a PhD. Although I think Rachel has a PhD as well, but it's that's not someplace I want to go. But I would like to discover or help create a place where people doing more modest stuff, like talking about the humanities or talking about open education or talking about whatever, can find people for whom that is relevant and interesting, and and maybe if they're educators, valuable, and build not only a community that's having some type of a dialogue about that, but some type of modest kind of
Well, the other
compensation from participant subscriber kind of people.
That's the other thing too, is to find the people who are making money in tangential or related spaces that you can either do a collab.
Mm-hmm.
That's the new buzzword.
Oh yeah.
Or some co-branded thing with that you can set something up, or essentially what you're buying is the email addresses of their subscriber list,
mm-hmm.
in a way that it makes sense for you. So, and that's what it's all about, especially in the newsletter space, is
right.
How can I get a copy of your subscriber list moving to my subscriber list,
mm-hmm.
for pennies on the dollar, right, so that the people who are following you are now subscribing and following to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think that yeah, and I think you're right, Chris. I think there is kind of a sort of cynical and not particularly fun, for me, sort of way of going about that, right? Where you just, sort of kind of pander to somebody, and then to try to try to get some eyeballs. I mean, and that was a big strategy on Twitter, right, for a while, as people were building, you know, kind of building lists of followers on Twitter, picking the right hashtags and things like that. I guess the question in my mind is there a sort of organic, kind of real and not, not, is there a space for people who want to engage in a way that has a, for lack of a better word, commercial aspect to it, but not a, I want to blow up and become Ali Abdaal commercial aspect?
Yeah. Can you even do that in an education space? Is there enough?
Yeah.
And if you think about it too, if you go back 1,000 years in the life of colleges and universities, the professor really, here's a building and a space you can teach in, but you as a professor are required to go out and bring your own students in who are going to pay you to teach.
Right.
And that's how you're going to make money.
Right.
And maybe you make a little more if you've written a book and you charge them a little bit to loan them that book, and then they can copy it out by hand or make their own annotations in the margins of their version of that book.
Right.
But that's how universities roughly started. And then it wasn't until much later that they were also employing you and paying you, and then they were the ones drawing the business in. And it would seem to me lately that with the administrative bloat, all the people they're drawing in and taking money from, they don't care so much about what's being taught or how or where or who's teaching it. So the administrators can cut back on all the people doing the teaching. And because
the only thing that matters is the credential at the end, is the bachelor's degree, and it doesn't really matter once you've got that bachelor's degree what you took in a life.
Well, and what's sad too is 6 months after you graduate, they may care that you have the piece of paper, but no one cares what your GPA was 6 months after. You may put it on your resume if it was a 4.0, but otherwise, it's what can you do?
Yeah.
I've never been asked for school result, college result, university result, professional membership ever. Yeah. But then I've never been on the open market. Almost all of my jobs have come from, I've phoned somebody and said, I'm thinking of moving. Do you know anybody that wants a me? And he says, no, I don't know, but I do. Or I get a phone call and headhunt. So, I've never needed my certificates, which is a good thing now because, like 10 years ago, I lost them.
Or I've actually seen there are a few universities now that either do it or subgroups that are affiliated with universities that do the older humanities stuff, like the great books. So you can go to University of Chicago and they have a great books program that is set up almost as a continuing education department. And for $500 a course, as a mid-career, I still want to learn something, or I want to do this as a hobby, or I'm retired and I need something to do and I've always wanted to read these books. But then they need faculty to actually teach and lead those courses. So they're giving them, and a lot of universities have extension departments where they're essentially leasing classroom space to teachers at night for $500 to $1,000 a class, and the professor is taking 70 or 80% of that income to teach the thing, and then they get the rest to keep the lights on.
Right.
But it's filling a hole for classroom space that's just sitting dead 3/4 of the day.
Well,
And you know,
there was two things I think that have tweaked my interest. Part of was Dan's recent retrenchment pieces, where he's been talking about those courses that are being done at college/university level with those facilities or those teachers going on a roving tour, like a journeyman, to high school/college students
Mhm.
to give them a taster almost, such that they also then get a college or a university credit to get them going to give an intro, etc., etc. And the other similar one was a repeat of what Chris said just now, but it's from a different point of view. We're talking about who are those people with the money, and it's all at the moment in that context. It's all the big companies who are trying to keep their better upper middle management types, who all want to learn something new, give them to make sure they've got a position in 5 or 10 years before they retire. And Tim Ferriss's guest 5 weeks ago, maybe, I can't remember exactly when, but it was there's a Brit who was a venture capitalist type person who got a degree in history from Oxford. And of course, those level colleges don't let go of their alumni. He happened to be in one of them for a can you give us some money meeting / lunch a while back.
Mhm.
And they're in the process of saying, when is the college empty? It's empty for the summer recess. So they're looking to make a summer school situation whereby they bolt in a summer school such that all these big middle managers take a sabbatical every 5 or 6 years. They spend 4 or 5 weeks at the school in the summer vacation, and then they do like a once a month or once a fortnight Zoom type meeting or get together meeting
Mhm.
to continue a whole year sabbatical on a course driven by those professors from whichever university, college, whatever. But the company pay for it, so it's a business orientated thing that is not necessarily give you an MBA version 2 if you've already got one or something. And it's a driven from we need to make more money, and we've got these resources that are dead in the water for 10 weeks.
Mhm.
And then as soon as we're in normal term, we need to flip that secondary use into a different mode because we've got all these 18, 20, 19, 20, 21-year-olds, plus a few, in residence doing the normal stuff. And it seemed like a damn good idea. And this guy was saying he would put money into kickstarting that. They haven't quite got the plan hard enough for him to make the investment.
Mhm.
And I forgot what his name is, but he's a Brit that did an early investment in about 10 other things, one of which was the first big online horse gambling website, as well as Filofax and a couple of other things, where he did about 10 really good bets that paid out with an ROI all in the level of like 50 times. And he almost, let's say, became a billionaire quite quickly and then just used the extra money to do bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
Mhm.
And it was a good Tim Ferriss, actually quite an interesting Tim Ferriss.
Hmm.
And almost no Silicon Valley type investments for all other
Mhm.
business. But it also talked about the Diageo takeover from Guinness and how that happened, etc., etc., etc. And other things. It wasn't just this guy's, and it's his second or third Tim Ferriss podcast, but it's a 600 and something episode. And it's another version of what you've been talking about in terms of where else could there be business, what other things you do other than by going to the office, teach a class, do some research, do a lab, do some meetings, and teach a class,
Right.
etc.
Well, it's also part of the I think there are two big elements, right? When people think about taking a class, right? There's the money and there's the time. And I think the biggest thing has been, the biggest advantage, of course, that higher ed has had is accreditation, right? You can get credits toward some type of a degree or a certificate or something, and that's the thing that the rest of the world doesn't have. The great courses. There's like MIT Open. There are these places who basically, of course, get a huge head start based on their brand identity, but also there was an organization called FutureLearn that the Open University in London kind of put together, that was a bunch of sort of Zoom or even just completely online asynchronous course stuff that was completely free, unless you wanted to get at the other end. You had a choice. Okay, you've completed this thing. If you want if you want a certificate of completion, then you can send us $70 or whatever. Khan Academy. There are a lot of and it's interesting because there are a lot of people like Khan Academy that have sort of aggregated, and have become an edifice sort of unto themselves. And so, and then there are diploma mills. There are University of Phoenix, kinds of things that. So I guess that's the question in my mind. Partially is, what is it that motivates people to want to consume informational educational content, right? Is it and I thought that was what was interesting. What Jesse Meadows was kind of saying about Huberman was that in order to to kind of suck in an audience and create a brand for himself, he had to sort of pander to some extent to this kind of pre-existing set of sort of weird prejudices that he could validate kind of with science, right? That we've got this long-standing tradition of abstain, this monastic kind of meme in our heads, that if we just if we abstain, if we act like monks, we will be tougher, we'll get the rewards and stuff. And he kind of leaned into that.
How can you pivot from your anti-vax business so that you can then run for president and use that as a means of making money? And even more so, how do you do that without having the last name Kennedy as an additional draw?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's,
You know, here's an interesting niche too, is like every university has PhD programs and they teach you and train you in your field, but the one thing they don't teach you how to do is teach once you're in your field. And that's the first thing you're guaranteed
true
to
that.
need to know how to do, because you're not, chances are really slim these days you're going to get, your first job is going to be a tenure track position at an R1 university, and boy golly, you're just on your way.
Mhm.
You're going to be teaching a load of 10 classes and
Right.
probably traveling to 3 different universities to make ends meet.
Road warrior. Yeah.
Your newly minted PhD has taught you nothing about how to interact with students, what's expected of you, how to pull it together, how to keep the boat afloat,
Mhm.
so that 10 years, 15 years from now, you might have that position at the R1 university and you can teach your one class a year and spend all the rest of the time researching and,
Mhm. Yeah.
administration,
Right.
your 25% administration time.
Right. Right.
You know,
Well, and
that-
it's partially, and actually the Kennedy example is a good example because, I don't really know that much about him, but I have to imagine that as an environmental lawyer, he was arguing cases, and he was, trying to get a binary outcome, win or lose. And maybe that sort of led him in the direction of collapsing the complexity into, sort of simple, binary points. But that, I mean, even on the vaccine thing, I mean, some of the things that I've heard have been, oh, it's complex. And collapsing that into a binary, pro-vax, anti-vax is kind of problematic. It's the same thing that we've been kind of going back and forth on, Mark, on the comments on that announcement that I made. Is, I mean, there's a lot of complexity in that question. I mean, they've simplified it, they've dumbed it down to a certain extent too much when they've just said zero textbook cost, right? And that's, although there is something sexy about saying Z degree, right? The actual, it's actually a spectrum, and the actual goal is to just try to find ways so that the default condition is not, that every semester, your biology class uses the next edition of the Cengage book for $350. And
or maybe, since all these universities want to pay consultants to come in and do the work that the administrators probably should be doing themselves, or at least be helping the professors do themselves, you should go find that other company. So something like, working at a place like, Pressbooks,
Mhm.
that's
Yeah.
a corporation within the OER space,
Right.
that at least the way I see it and view it, it's not an icky,
Yeah.
we want all your data kind of
Right.
company. They actually seem to be, they, or Hypothesis seems to be not toxic companies that are actually doing actual things and providing
Right.
an actual service or a product or a thing.
Mhm.
But because you've got the teaching experience, the OER experience, and the technology piece, something like that may be
Yeah.
a fascinating place for you to work in or around, or at least near.
Right. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. And it's funny too, because I know, I guess I got involved with Pressbooks when they, again, a couple of years ago, and we were talking about you before you came on about, what your connection with Hypothesis, and it was the same, and I think I was speaking for it. I think yours is similar to mine, that you just got involved early enough that it was easy to be actually in contact with people like Remy and Jeremy Dean and those folks who were, and in my experience, Steele Wagstaff, early on was kind of big, the guy who was coming out to open ed conferences and for Pressbooks and kind of evangelizing for them. And yeah, I think that those were good people who had had a kind of a foot in academia and in this new technology space. I think that is that's
They're based in Virginia, but a little bit remote as well. And I know one of the CEO is, calling in from Italy.
oh, which
But
one? Who's that?
Reclaim Hosting is another kind of like interesting model where
Yep.
he was at Mary Washington creating a program on how to create a domain of one's own, and then built a hosting company that caters to education.
Mm.
And how do you build and host all of these applications for professors and universities to use on their own?
Yeah.
That
Well,
would
it was
be-
kind of it was kind of interesting too. I met Martin Dougiamas, the guy who invented Moodle and runs it still, I think, at OE Global in Milan in 2019 in November, and he was already adding. He was adding a bunch of stuff. And I've probably talked about him before. He was very focused on sort of what's education going to be like in 25 years, and not so much on how do I get more seats for Moodle at this conference. And they were a sponsor of the conference. But one of the things that he was just introducing, I think it kind of started to the point where it's actually beginning to happen like now-ish, in the last 6 months, is this thing called Moodle Net, which is sort of an international community of open education interested educators who can basically put their entire courses up, and that seems to me to be to kind of
But
also,
the key, I think, is finding some company that is. I think the key is finding some company that kind of fits into what I would call an ethical ed tech space.
Mhm.
And there's too many of them that are just horrible,
yeah.
and they want your dollars and pay us a lot of money for no actual service, which is, one of the things I like about, the hypothesis model is
Mhm.
there's actually a thing there, and it's a great product and a great service.
Mhm.
And if they can help you scale it up
Right.
and teach you as a university department or individual professor in a class, and give you a range of here's what this could look like
Mhm.
in a reasonable way for
Yeah.
a reasonable amount.
Right. Well, and that was the problem that they had, and I've probably told this story before too, was that they came to us and said, okay, we have this new LTI plugin that will bolt onto your learning management system, and will do all of this, hypothesis stuff in, Blackboard or in Moodle or in, Desire or whatever, Brightspace, and it didn't. The problem was that it wasn't really kind of well enough differentiated from the thing that already existed, that it made sense for us to pay a boatload of money to do that when we could just use it in the wild. And those are Jeremy's words, in the wild. He was always like, Dan's going to use it in the wild, because I was not as positive about this as I should have been. And, but that was kind of a problem. It was like, okay, so yeah, I love what Hypothesis is doing, but I can create private course groups and do this, and the only thing I'm missing really is, the grading. I have to actually read people's stuff and then, say, okay, you're going to get this many points for doing that, and then put it into a grade book somewhere. But yeah, but and then there are other people, there's like David Wiley, who sort of invented to some extent, OER, and, and he kind of came up with the five R's, right? Reuse, remix, retain, whatever. There are these 5 R's of OER, which I'm sure Chris will now put in the in the chat. And so he was there at the beginning, and he's famous for that. And then he created this organization, this thing called Lumen Learning, and it was gonna be an open ed tech kind of company. And he keynoted at the last conference I went to at the University of Wisconsin. And oh, thank you. What was your 6th R? let me look at that. And he was actually saying, well, okay, inclusive access is a good thing now. And the reason for it really was that he couldn't figure out how to make a, you know, how to have a company and how to earn a living, you know, when everybody was, you know, sort of creating their own stuff. And so he said, well, okay, I'll create this little walled garden in which these open, you know, texts and things and open, you know, course, you know, packs and quiz packs and all these things can exist, but I'll sort of somehow control access to it. It's weird. Oh, I like that. Request update. Yeah. That's a versioning, updating and keeping things current is something that that's kind of a missing link in that world as well. Yeah. So, I mean, that was a, you know, and I was disappointed with that. And I kind of challenged him during his keynote about, you know, sort of the, you know, yeah. I mean, I felt bad for the guy, but I didn't, you know, I had to kind of jump up and say something.
How to fix it all?
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
how do we do that?
Right.
What's the answer?
Yeah.
We know what the problem is. How do we fix it?
Well, and yeah, and that whole
we can't-
issue that really is behind it all is the gun to the head of accreditation, right? Learning and getting credit for learning are really kind of two different things. And the, you know, and the needing to get credit is, you know, creates a bunch of sort of perverse incentives.
And it all ends up going into the bullshit jobs category anyway.
Well, especially the accreditation, yeah, the accreditation side of it.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of funny because in this whole no, I'll be VP. Yeah, it's weird because in the, you know, in these meetings that I've been having at the university about the, you know, about all of this craziness that's going on, you know, they have sort of, oftentimes they sort of devolve into things, you know, we have to completely reorganize the university and, you know, but instead we're fighting on who gets to who gets to read professional development plans and professional development reports, you know, because the deans are the faculty's actual supervisors. So we can't have department heads, you know, filtering those and weighing in on them and then just, you know, sending them to the dean for signature. We have to have the deans, you know, spending all their time doing this. And it's just like, and my reaction to that was, you know, and we spent hours discussing it, you know, in our department meeting in the morning and then in the other meeting in the afternoon. And my reaction to it, and I said this in the department meetings, I hate PDRs. They are, in my mind, they're bullshit. There is no, you know, there is no actual value to them. And everybody was like, what? You know, and one person says, I love PDR, but it's like this whole, you know, this whole creating this work product around, you know, what do I want to do in my classes to improve them? You know, I can have a 5-minute conversation or a series of 5-minute conversations with, you know, the department head or with colleagues or things like that and figure this out. But instead it's grown into this monster thing that you have to write a plan and you have to write a report, you know, and it has to be, you know, X number of pages long and have all this documentation attached. And, you know, and then the dean basically has to spend her entire life, you know, reading. I mean, if you're the dean of like 50 people, imagine how much time you spend.
I would have butted in. When I started in my professional life, you could hand over a $5 million building with a 1-page letter from the architect, right? And that was it. That was all the client was legally entitled to. And that letter kicked off things like, oh, here's my final invoice minus retention, which is due in 12 months from the date of month. And to do that same letter now, in many places here, UK, the US, you end up with having about, for a multiply up for inflation, $150 million project would need to be attached about 5 to 10 gigabytes worth of data
Right.
in an approved format,
Mm-hmm.
such that it can be read and updated and kept live by an approved, but not a singular, what's known as a BIM, Building Information Management System,
Mm-hmm.
that has literally every piece of paper of the entire project, which
Right.
includes the client's piece of paper that says, I think I need a new building. Right?
Yeah.
Or I need to spend some money. Let's build a new building,
Mm-hmm.
etc., etc., etc. So all the way down to the soap, the automatic soap dispenser uses 37 5mm, 36mm long screws
Right.
with a hex nut. You know, and so you've got every drawing, old and new. So you've got the entire development, so you can see where the mistakes were.
Mm-hmm.
But you also know what the final product was, and all the calculations, and all the progress photographs, and all the meeting notes, etc., etc., etc. All in a searchable way. And in the middle of those two extremes, in the UK in the mid-90s, we finally decided to be almost that way, with a certified design process, CDP or something,
Mm-hmm.
that actually made it mandatory at handover to give the owner, operator, client, agent a working operating maintenance manual for the building they just bought.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could be talking, as we did for one of the 20-story tower blocks I did that had nothing special in it. In that context, there's a few lifts, there's a cooling system, there's a power system, no data center per se, no swimming pool, no aquarium, minor kitchens, a couple of server rooms. The rest was just plain office and some meeting rooms. And it was final size of documentation was 160 lever arch frames, which is, and because the client was a lawyer, he has a process that says, oh, can I borrow your temporary manual so I can start reading it beforehand? So I said, yeah, fine, because I was a joint appointment by occupier as well as developer. And I had it back within the hour because he's a lawyer, right? As opposed to Joe Blogs that had to send it out for a week's worth of copying because it was A4, A3, double-sided colour, folded inside pockets, and God knows what in the 150 lever arch. And now, of course, you just put it on a 4 terabyte drive and hand it over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You don't even need to do multiple copies anymore because they just drop it onto a server. It's available to the FM team and everybody else that needs to know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and to some extent, there's a lot of, I mean, there are good things that come out. There is accountability that comes out of that, right? And there is a capability to sort of understand, when something goes wrong, maybe where it happened. But really, it's a lot. It's also a lot of sort of ass covering, right? That is, that replaces actual, relationships that would have ensured that people understood what they were asking for and what they were getting and who was accountable and, and all those things. Oh, that's really interesting. Thanks, Chris. I'll take a look at that. Yeah, I think in education as well, probably there's an element of because these outcomes are so hard to subjectively evaluate, right? That we resort to numbers and metrics and and assessments, quantitative assessments, and then that makes that more amenable to that kind of management. Yeah,
Gets gained anyway.
I haven't. I actually, Chris, the book that you suggested, I specifically, rather than buying it, I specifically asked for the library to get it for me, just so that there'll be a trail of it, kind of.
Oh, which book?
Oh, the one that you suggested in the comment about
the
Ginsburg book about higher ed becoming administrative rather than education oriented.
Yeah, he's been tracking that professionally since the 70s, I think. And there's some if you'll see graphs and charts in there, and you'll be just totally befuddled.
Yeah.
Um,
So yeah, but it's the thing to me is, if I could sort of glom onto people's excitement about finding something out, right? That would be the in a way that is actually real and that is not just pandering to their preconceptions, like what this Jesse is accusing Huberman of doing, and doesn't have to do that to find a niche. If I could the ideal thing would be to find a community of people who want to, like, for example, my environmental history, which I'm revising my textbook. I'm teaching it, this book, and I'm teaching it again in the, starting Monday online. And I'm thinking, well, if I'm teaching this online, then, that's just about ready to be portable, right? And to be available online for anybody in the world, regardless of whether they're, in the Minnesota state system. And, and if I can find people who I can interest in that, just as an experience, right? As something to learn, as some things to think about, So I'm wondering, what do I have to do to this to make it that?
Well, I would have thought, given the current discussions that are going online in all the sort of Twitter, Facebook, Mastodon space, there is so much knee-jerk on both sides of the aisle, as it were, on all the news reports of, there's this new temperature maximum, there's this new ice minimum, there's this whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you had somebody that says, this is how the whole thing has evolved and developed and grown,
mm-hmm.
as I imagine, I've not looked at much of your book, I have a copy, but it just hasn't risen to the top of the readme pile quite. Partly because we could keep doing similar things here. That a lot of what I see from not really those deniers types, those people that just don't have the level of detail of the history as, well, when did we know this, or why do we know this, or how do we know this?
Yeah.
And then it's like, oh, that's news to me. Well, yeah, but it was in as that standard mean where the CO2 and the temperature thing gets linked, that we all have the mean picture from the 18 something odd newspaper in New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
And when you put that referencing to Snopes just to make sure it's not dodgy. Turns out it's a direct plagiarism lift out of Popular Mechanics.
Mhm.
But it took about 18 months to transfer,
Right.
right? And it's like so it's even older than you think because
Yeah.
you know, and
Mhm.
and then
it's,
of
it's
course
interesting because there's
so I think
Yes,
that's
we-
your market. That
there
could
are-
easily become your market.
Mhm. Yeah, it's weird. I'm another thing that I'm doing on the side is I am advising the U.S. Academic Decathlon on their this year or next year, actually they're preparing this year for next year's thing, which is a climate related topic for the Academic Decathlon for the year, and they have this manual that they're going to send out to everybody, and they asked me to comment on it before to give the author some suggestions and stuff, and before they go ahead and publish it. And it's interesting because there is there is some interest, I think, Tim, to kind of what you're saying. There is some interest in kind of correcting the record, saying, okay, this was known, then, and this was, and this is something that people have been, that people, that it's not a new discovery, or it didn't, the thing that we, especially, challenging the master narrative, right? That this is not all of the story, right? And then just also, just kind of some details that are taken for granted, right? For a long time. And actually, it was in a different YouTube account. I had this really super popular, like 5-minute long video that was called "Beringia Was Not a Bridge," and I took it off ultimately because it wasn't very well done, and I actually used some images that probably were copyrighted. So it was like before I knew anything about how to post a YouTube video. But it was about this idea that that the landmass between between Siberia and Alaska in what's now the Bering Strait was this long-term, sort of continental landmass. It was as wide as Alaska is now, and it lasted for 10,000 years. And that wasn't the only time that it existed. It existed again and again and again at glacial maxima, throughout the deep past. And it got huge traffic. It got thousands, tens of thousands of hits because I guess just because it was the first time anybody had said that. We always say land bridge, and a land bridge, a bridge is something that's deliberate, and it's about crossing, right? And that so that that was sort of a correction.
And a bridge is always something thin and narrow.
It's thin and narrow, right? You don't spend time on it. You're going from point A to point B, crossing it, right? And so, so there was, so I was challenging the idea,
unless it's London Bridge or
London
Portney Bridge,
right?
Or Portney Bridge, both of which have got shops on,
right? Yeah, and probably residences upstairs, and all of that. But that would be the exception that kind of proves the rule. And so my point was that it was that people lived there for millennia, and they didn't think of it as a land bridge. They thought of it as the place that they lived, and so.
But it's also a similar issue in our lifetimes, aside from the population doubling and all that crap. Plate tectonics has become, high school topic.
Mm-hmm.
Yet when I was doing geology at high school, it hadn't quite landed at schools. It was in universities, and it takes time to trickle down.
Sure.
But it clearly happened. So I can remember before high school, at junior school, I had tempted to say a National Geographic popular science book that was all about evolution and migration of prehistoric mammals. So it's the mastodons rather than the mammoth, and the elephants type thing. So you've got all these weird and wonderful, relatively large, and the typical National Geographic, where there's lots of really good graphics and the fold outs.
Mhm.
So you get these multicolour pictures and there's all these different animals. It's a bit like Find Wally, but they're all got little dot numbers and all the rest of it. But it was all predicated on the world is the way the world is, and there's land bridges from South Africa to Argentina,
Mhm.
etc. Right?
Mhm.
And although there's no picture of them in that context, it's always written as though they're at best 10 miles wide and 3,000 miles long.
Right.
And it's just before, I suppose that book it was such a good picture book about the animals, if you ignore the lack of plate tectonics, that it got worn out and busted by the time I was 12. At about the time I was like 13 or 14, the BBC did a small series, and I think it was Roger Caldwell, something like that, did the BBC textbook, The Restless Earth, which was the same title as the series.
Mhm.
That was the popular science for everybody description of this is what plate tectonics is and how we know and what. So there's this 50-50 split in black and white book and colour book. It was nowhere near as colourful as the National Geographic, but it was an equivalent popular science book that would become the plate tectonics textbook for what you should have had at school, and it wasn't. You know, I was doing geology formally 2 years later, and it still wasn't in the normal textbook because we were still literally using I think it was something like the 27th edition of Lyell's 1826 or something stupid, Geology of the British Isles.
Yep.
Right? Because guess what? The rocks don't change that much.
Right.
Science might, but geology was very much how to go out and draw pictures of fossils to make sure you got the right ID and
Right.
what. Yeah. So, and that was all relatively done and dusted, except of course, if you then read something that was like 25 years later, Burgess Shale, wonderful work, land by Stephen Jay Gould, and then what's happened since.
Right.
It's like, oh, all you got to do is turn it up this way or flip it over,
Mhm.
and now you've got an animal that looks like an animal as opposed to something really stupid.
Yeah.
And you then realise, rather like the current meme that I saw the other day that said, 100,000 years' time, the archaeologist is going to have a real problem if the primary thing they find out about our culture is manga haiku comics, that therefore our primary food has got to be breast milk with semen over it. Because that's what they find, and it's like reading the Egyptian hieroglyphics. Rather like we said about the Egyptian hieroglyphics, an original reading didn't explain why they could build the pyramids, because they didn't understand what the two water carriers were at the front of the pathway of all those blocks on rollers. And now we know, supposedly, and yeah, it lowers the coefficient of friction, etc., etc. But just to fly it back to the book, I'm just surprised how much you guys let these Christians get into this policy.
It's like sometimes the sexiness of the presentation, the old book, right? The old diagram, especially, right? We have these diagrams, and I still see them sometimes there are these diagrams of fetal, of very early embryos, right? And they put the chicken next to the sheep next to the human. And they say, see, they all look the same at 2 weeks or whatever. And, and it's all sort of tied up in this thing that Ernst Haeckel kind of came up with in the 19th century called recapitulation theory, right? And the theory was that in the development from fertilized egg to birth, the embryo would actually go through all of the stages of development from evolution, right? It would be a fish, and then it would be a bird, and then and all these things, which is not at all true, but so beautifully presented with these diagrams that somehow it's like people don't say that anymore, but they still use these diagrams, and there's still kind of this way that people almost misunderstand this because that was so sticky in people's minds. So, and it's weird because, people will come, and then, Richard Dawkins will talk about memes, and how they kind of take over and have, a life of their own, which, he presented that so well that people actually, believe that too, that somehow memes evolve as if they are organisms. So yeah, there's a lot, this, and in this space, oh, my mother's trying to FaceTime me. Sorry about that. Oh yeah. Yep. There are,
at least once a month I see an Ernst Haeckel something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was huge. I mean, and these people are, from way back, like Liebig's law and Haeckel, recapitulation, and all of this stuff that has persisted. Not to mention bigger things like Marx. So yeah, how do we create spaces and opportunities for communication where people can be exposed to these things, not just to things that confirm their biases that they already have. It's going to be interesting to see that develop. And I guess we've spent our entire time talking about this, and we haven't gotten on to the connection with religion.
I tried.
Sorry, you did. You began with that, and then I derailed you. The connection with religion. I had an argument at the Foundation for Education, for Economic Education in Irvington on the Hudson River in their mansion when I went to that thing that they paid for me to go to. They gave me a fellowship to their summer session. I had an argument with one of the directors of the place, who was a minister, about whether or not you could have morality without religion. And I was I had always been kind of an atheist, but at that moment I was heavily influenced by Ayn Rand's atheism in the libertarian space, and I just walked all over that.
You just need Christopher Hitchens.
That's why I hadn't yet read Christopher Hitchens, but that's why I need to be the vice president, not the president, because I will stand up and shoot my mouth off in those situations.
If I'm reading you correctly, what you're saying is you want an educational institution that's decoupled from capitalism.
If people could just learn the shit that interests them, that they need to learn, without this accredited university structure, I would be happy to make stuff available to the world and just say, okay, throw me a bone, throw me enough to keep the lights on, and I'll be happy, continuing to make this stuff. Because I think that there are enough people. I actually do think, that there are enough people out in the world who, if I tell these stories in an interesting way, would value them, would learn from them, would come, if I can get the message out right, would come and listen to them. Having that other, infrastructure attached to them is the thing that's, that's problematic. And yeah, so a thing that blew up the whole the whole structure of higher ed and made it um, much more open and accessible to people without, but and then then of course you've got all of those questions of controls, of of peer review, of how do we verify and validate things. We should, I mean, I guess if we're going to finish this conversation today, we should say Medium. We should go back to Medium, Substack, WordPress. What other ways are work for people to get to get information out there. I mean, I remember, way back in the chat, Mark, you mentioned, using YouTube to announce that you had done something on. I mean, that's what I used to do. I used to do something on my blog, on my own website, that I owned the domain to, and then announce it on YouTube. Say, hey, I just said something about this, or I just wrote this, or I just made this.
Yeah, I think my point was the system keeps changing underneath your feet.
Yeah.
Like I used to think of it as you needed a way for people to discover you, and maybe to discover specific things you had to say about specific topics.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't YouTube. I was saying Twitter was kind of like that
right.
for a while. Now that's all weird. So,
Mm-hmm.
but then once you had announced your presence, people would use RSS
Mm-hmm.
to follow where it was that you said these things. And in fact, what RSS was good for was you didn't have to go through everything. You could just kind of, invest a small amount of effort in reviewing titles,
right,
for blog posts, and it was a great system.
Yeah.
I don't know whatever happened. Right, RSS kind of went away. People relied more and more on, I don't know, Twitter or something,
or their Facebook feed or whatever.
It was more discovery than discovery. You didn't discover people to follow. You discovered specific things now, and I think the demise of RSS, which I'm convinced is pretty much happening, has been replaced by having to have a way to gain a reputation. I don't know, more at a deeper level. I don't know. I can't figure it all out. It's beyond me, but that's the kind of thing I'm kind of interested in figuring out. And so when, you made this commitment, it's interesting. I had mentioned, I'm going to follow somebody on Substack and it's going to cost me this. And my wife, who I don't know what she listens to, she follows 2 or 3 of these channels from the women influencers or whatever they are that she continually listens to that stuff, which is fine. But I was just surprised that she actually had much more familiarity than I do, because she's in that, following mode, I guess I would describe it.
Yeah,
the issue is, where are the eyeballs and how do you capture them?
Yeah.
And I would say over the last 20 years, probably the most powerful platform is having your own email address list and some simple, easy to maintain website.
Mm-hmm.
Do those 2 things. Probably the best tool I know right now that does both of those, that's easy, turnkey, very little tech. There's a service called micro.blog that supports every spec and standard that you can shake a stick at. And for $5 a month, they give you your own website that lets you, post longer content, videos, podcasts, short tweets. And if you want to send it to Mastodon or be subscribable on something like Mastodon, that spec is built into it, so it's there. Or if you want to send stuff to Twitter or other places, it'll kind of auto syndicate that stuff to you and let you do that. and it also has I think I'm pretty sure it has a newsletter functionality, and you can take in email addresses and send stuff out. But just even a cheap free, you could still go to Blogger and collect email addresses, and then once a week collect all the stuff you wrote and email it out, cut and paste it into a newsletter, and go. That's probably the most valuable thing over time.
Right.
And then you don't have to worry about, is Twitter going to shut down next week? And suddenly I've lost everything I've spent 20 years 17 years building there.
Right.
Otherwise you're doing a lot of work for them to capture your value instead of you capturing your value.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is something that I have been concerned about. I was curious. Somebody mentioned Scott. I just looked at his website, and he's creating an army. He says, but that's the thing is, will anybody? So he's got this picture of himself in his crazy jacket and with his cap on backwards, and he's creating an army. But of whom, where, and for what? And yeah, it's weird because it seems to be so sort of self-contained. I'm sure it's big enough to keep him in his in his plaid Model S with the lime green wrap, but I mean that's the world. That's that kind of weird big small world of the web, right? That we he could be. I mean, it could be huge, but we don't know. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I subscribed to his newsletter for a couple of issues, and it came out of his book, which we talked about. But the newsletter had nothing to do with notes and that sort of thing. It turned into a marketing book. Right. It was all marketing, and he was using his own techniques to get you to not cancel your subscription. And so it became a cult the way he was I thought the way he was designing it. And oh my God.
Yeah.
There used to be a late night guy on TV. And his whole gig was teaching people how to buy and sell stuff. And literally that's what he said. And the whole idea, and he taught you these marketing things, and do experiments in newspaper ads and et cetera, et cetera. Well, he went bankrupt eventually, but it was a whole, I'm going to make rich off of trying to teach you how to do something that really isn't all that successful.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, he did kind of give away the fact that his original idea was always he wanted to have a newsletter. He loved those newsletters that he got back in the day. I remember 1,000 years ago subscribing to it. When I was in the securities industry, I subscribed to an investor newsletter thing, and it was kind of cool. You kind of felt like you were part of a little club. You were getting the scoop that nobody else had, and you had some type of leg up on everybody. Yeah, zine. Yep, there was a zine thing too. There was an app that I used for a little while that would aggregate a bunch of stuff and create something that looked like a newsletter. Yeah, it's. I mean, so many different things. I guess we're going to have to talk about chapter 7, 8, and 9 next week, because we are at noon, and Tim just had to go, which probably means we all need to go.
Well, it's also time to start thinking about the next book too, probably. So
mm-hmm. I might put Jaron Lanier on the list, because it's the stuff that we talk about, in my mind keeps coming back to things that he said, and he hasn't really, he hasn't got anything brand new that's just out, but but I think Who Owns the Future, might still be kind of relevant. But that's just that's just off the top of my head. We can do that, and we can although that nominate the books page was getting kind of confusing for me because I couldn't tell what was more recent and what was just more popular. Oh, okay, yeah.
Because we were talking about education and
Yep.
I didn't
Yeah.
even know why. I think they showed up in my little free library last month, and I pulled it out to take a look.
Oh, nice. So people actually do contribute as well as take books out of there for you?
Yeah.
That's nice.
This neighborhood isn't as much fun as my old neighborhood. My old neighborhood had there were way better book clubs in my old neighborhood. So I was getting like almost brand new copies of things that came out a week ago.
Oh,
like,
nice.
And now, and it's also tougher now. In the new neighborhood, I put one in, and then like 10 other people decided we've got to have our own too. So it's also kind of diffused out
Yeah.
It's not like we live in a book desert.
Right.
In my
well, that's actually kind of a metaphor for for all this that we've been talking about.
Yeah. So I tend to I know 15 book desert little free libraries in the Los Angeles area. So I tend to slowly cull things from the neighborhood libraries, and then I drive over and drop off and refill the book desert libraries. Don't tell my neighbors.
That's cool. Yeah, I live on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, so I would have to find a place to put one that was closer to population. But yeah, I have seen a few around. When I go to places where actual people live, like the Twin Cities, I see they're all over.
Well, and they started in Wisconsin, if I recall. So
good.
I was in early, but I think mine is number 8,000 and change, and the serial numbers they're giving away now are well over 300,000. So
wow, I didn't know there was
they're everywhere.
That's like your member number at your co-op.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so so next week we will talk about 7, 8, and 9. Shall we add 10 just for the hell of it? And then we could actually, if we added 10, that would leave us with 11 through 15 for a final one. Maybe we should add 10 and probably 10. 7, 8, 9, 10 for next week. All right, cool. Well, thank you very much. This was fun. I will be checking things out from the chat, which I will post like right away as soon as the Zoom gives me the recording. So
sounds good.
See you next week. Thank you.
Thanks, folks.